In this lecture, we will focus on learning enhancement as it relates to training. So if we think about the training process, which is the process we use to develop, implement, and evaluate a training program, we can think about these four phases here, which are to first assess training needs, second, to address the characteristics of the trainee, the organization, and training to enhance learning, third, to choose and administer appropriate training methods or a single method, and then finally to evaluate the training program's effectiveness. Now, today we're going to focus on this phase, which is focused on learning enhancement, and specifically to address trainee characteristics and the organizational context and how they interact with the training itself, and how we can consider those in order to ensure that people will learn the most that they can and get the most that they can out of the training itself. So we'll first start with an overview, and then we'll move on to trainee characteristics, and then finally we'll finish up with the organizational context. So let's start with the overview. So first, when we're thinking about learning enhancement considerations, we want to first consider the trainees themselves. And so we can think about different characteristics of the trainees, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But these generally include things such as individual difference variables, such as their personality, their cognitive ability or intelligence, as well as their self-efficacy and their motivation to learn in general. Now, in addition, when considering how to enhance learning from a training program, we want to also consider the organizational context. And the organizational context is really where we think about what are the different features or supports that we have in place that can help people transfer what they learned in the training itself to the job that they're actually performing, that the training is actually designed to improve the performance on. And then finally, we want to generally consider how trainee characteristics and the organizational context interact with the training content itself, or whatever training methods we're using. Because perhaps there could be certain training methods that might be more appropriate for trainees with certain characteristics, and they might be more appropriate with organizational supports that might be more applicable to certain types of organizations or organizations with certain types of resources, for example. So now let's dig a little bit deeper into trainee characteristics as a consideration when it comes to learning enhancement within a training program. So it's important to consider employee readiness for training by identifying the characteristics of the trainees themselves that can or will enhance or detract from their learning. So as an example, or as some examples, these are some training characteristics that we often focus on, and that there's been scientific evidence and research and scientific study of these specific trainee characteristics and their influence on training performance, where training performance could be how quickly or efficiently someone is able to learn training content, as well as how effectively or how much they're able to learn within the training context or the training program. So the four examples that we'll focus on today are personality and cognitive ability, self-efficacy, motivation to learn, and metacognitive skill. So let's start with personality and cognitive ability. Now, certain individual difference variables have been found to influence the extent to which a trainee will be receptive to and able to learn in the training environment. And personality and cognitive ability are two examples of what we call individual difference variables, in that they're ways in which different people or individuals can differ from one another. And these tend to be relatively stable variables that we're talking about here. While personality and cognitive ability can change over the course of a lifespan or a lifetime, they don't necessarily change quickly on a day-to-day basis or very much on a day-to-day basis. These are things that slowly evolve throughout a lifetime, and for the most part, we can consider them to be relatively stable characteristics of a person. Where if you think about personality, it's a person's relatively stable characteristics of thought, emotion or affect, and behavior. Whereas with cognitive ability, we're thinking about how well people are able to learn, how well they're able to reason, whether that's spatial reasoning, numerical reasoning, and so forth and so on. So what do we know from the research? Well, we do know that when it comes to personality, higher levels of conscientiousness, extroversion, and openness to experience tend to be associated with higher training performance. So when people are more conscientious, they have a higher level of extroversion, and or they're more open to new experiences or to different experiences, they tend to perform better within the training environment. Now, if you're familiar with these three dimensions, these personality dimensions of conscientiousness, extroversion, and openness to experience, you'll recognize that they're part of the big five personality dimensions, where the two dimensions that aren't listed here would be agreeableness, and then the dimension that is called either neuroticism or by the opposite end of the continuum, which is emotional stability. But the three that tend to be associated with higher training performance, at least consistently in the research, are conscientiousness, extroversion, and openness to experience. Now, when it comes to cognitive ability, we found in past research that higher general cognitive ability, which is sometimes just shortened or abbreviated as lowercase g, that higher general cognitive ability is associated with higher training performance. So in other words, people who tend to be more intelligent or have higher levels of intelligence, they tend to perform better on training, which is probably not too surprising, because we also know that people with higher general cognitive ability tend to perform better on jobs. And in fact, we tend to see that that relationship between general cognitive ability and job performance and task performance tends to be even stronger when a job is higher in complexity, meaning that it necessitates higher levels of cognitive ability to be able to do that particular job well. So when thinking about how to enhance learning, these are some things to consider, is that you're going to have people that differ with respect to their personality and their cognitive ability. And so it's important to recognize that perhaps different types of training programs, especially when you're considering cognitive ability, you may need to have additional modules or something like that that can help get everybody to the same, up to speed and to the same page. Or you might have different avenues or ways in which people can learn that might better suit where they are in terms of their cognitive ability. Now, in terms of conscientiousness, extroversion, and openness to experience, these are dimensions of personality that when it comes to considering how we can use these when it comes to learning enhancement, think about what the behaviors and the thoughts are that are associated with these three dimensions. If you're thinking about conscientiousness, you're thinking about those people who are dutiful, they tend to be achievement oriented, they tend to follow directions well and so forth. So those are things you could remind someone to do in the training context. So even if they don't have a high natural level of conscientiousness, you could remind them to engage in those types of behaviors specifically in the training context. And the same goes with extroversion and openness to experience as well. So getting people to be a little bit more outgoing and sociable during the training process, even if they tend to be more naturally on the introversion end of the continuum, can be a good way to get people engaged and active in their learning process and their learning experience. And then with openness to experience, try to find a way to get the training to resonate with people so that the content is something that can appeal to them and interest them in an intrinsic or an innate way that hopefully drives their curiosity about learning more about that training content. And then ultimately these things can lead to higher training performance. So now let's shift gears and talk about self-efficacy and motivation to learn as two things that we should consider when it comes to learning enhancement with respect to a training program. Now, what is self-efficacy? Well, to quote Bauer, Erdogan, Coughlin, and Truxillo 2020, self-efficacy is a person's belief that they can accomplish a task. Okay, so it's your confidence in your ability to be able to do something. And specifically, we can say to be able to do a task for a job in the context of work. And within the context of training, it could be your confidence in your belief that you're able to accomplish different aspects of a training program. Now, what do we know from the research? Well, we know that self-efficacy tends to be associated with higher training performance, meaning that people who have stronger beliefs that they're able to accomplish something, specifically related to the training, tend to have higher training performance. So that probably is not too surprising. That's a fairly intuitive finding there. Now, self-efficacy can, or rather we can increase, if we want to figure out how we can increase self-efficacy to then improve training performance, we can do so by breaking down the training program into smaller bites or pieces. What this allows people to do is to build confidence and their belief in their ability to accomplish something by having these little wins and victories along the way. Okay, and so that's one way you can build self-efficacy, as opposed to just giving people the whole and asking them to accomplish everything at once. Instead, break it down into different parts or bite-sized pieces and then let them go from there. Now, what about motivation to learn? Well, motivation to learn refers to a person's sustained willingness to apply effort and spend time learning. In other words, their motivation to learn. Target KSAOs, competencies, and or behaviors, where KSAOs, if you recall, refers to knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics. So again, that's a person's sustained willingness to apply effort and to spend time learning target KSAOs, competencies, and or behaviors. Now, sometimes you hear this referred to as trainee motivation. So if you hear motivation to learn in the training context, you can also think trainee motivation. And self-efficacy is very much related to a person's willingness to apply effort and to spend time learning. If they believe that they can accomplish a task, they're more likely to spend time doing so and to apply more effort or intensity in doing so. Now, with respect to motivation to learn, we can increase trainee motivation and their motivation to learn by creating a perceived need for training or learning. And what that means is trying to give them a sense of urgency and need around why they should engage with this training program, why they should focus on learning from this training program. A classic example that came about by Smith, Jenst, and colleagues back in the 90s was they looked at air traffic controllers and looked at how to increase their perceived need for training, where an air traffic controller is someone that part of their job is to make sure that planes at an airport take off safely and that they don't collide with one another in the air. And so, or on the ground, I guess, for that matter. And so one of the things that is important, or they found that can be effective, is creating that perceived sense of need for getting trained on how to be a better air traffic controller. And one thing you might do, for example, is provide information or data about people's near misses, or maybe the accident rate, or how often planes actually collide and what the consequences are for that. And so this can help create a sense of urgency and a need around actually engaging in a training program around making sure that planes stay safe in the air and they stay a safe distance from one another. So you can get really creative about how you create a perceived need for a particular training program or learning program that you have in your organization. Now, another thing to consider when it comes to increasing trainee motivation to learn is to clearly communicate training goals and objectives at the outset and throughout the training. Make sure both the trainer and the trainee themselves knows what the training goals and objectives are. What is it that they're supposed to take away from this training? What is the purpose? Now, finally, to increase trainee motivation to learn, another thing we can do is ensure the training goals and objectives are specific and difficult yet achievable. And this really dovetails with classic Locken-Latham goal setting theory, where the evidence suggests that the most effective goals in terms of getting people to strive for those goals and to be motivated to accomplish those goals are those goals that are going to be specific, not general, and those goals that are difficult, so not too easy, but they need to be difficult yet achievable. Okay? So these are things to consider as well, as make sure when you're writing those training goals and objectives and communicating them to people, to make sure that those training goals and objectives are specific and difficult yet achievable. Now, finally, let's wrap up talking about the trainee characteristic of metacognitive skill. So what is metacognitive skill? Well, to quote Bauer, Erdogan, Coughlin, and Trixillo 2020, metacognitive skill can be defined as a person's ability to step back and assess their own skill, performance, or learning. Okay, so this is metacognition. It's taking a step back and thinking about how you think, in other words, or thinking about how you learn things, how you perform, and your own skills that you have. Okay, this has been found to influence a person's learning effectiveness, with some people are being actually naturally more competent or having gained skills in this at being more competent at self-assessing their own performance and their own learning. Okay, so this is something that people can build and to develop throughout their lifetime, but some people will tend to have a natural ability to do so, like so many other things in life. Okay, but it has been found in the research to influence a person's learning effectiveness. Now, how can we go about supporting trainees' metacognition and to make sure that they're applying metacognitive skill? Well, we can do this in a few ways. One thing that we can do is to give frequent and ongoing feedback about the trainee's actual performance. So make sure that we give feedback about how they're doing in the training program along the way. Don't just wait to the end. Remind people about how they're doing so it gets them to step back and assess their own skill, performance, or learning, which again is at the heart of the definition for metacognitive skill. Now, another thing that we can do is to remind trainees to reflect on how well they have been learning the training content. So actually giving them space and giving them permission to step back and apply their metacognitive skill. So this will again allow them to think about what do they know already, what do they not yet know, and what do they still have to learn, and how can they do that in the remaining time in the training program. So now let's focus on organizational context. So we talked about trainee characteristics and some common examples of those, and now let's focus on the organizational context and how we can use this to help enhance learning in the training program. So one of the key concepts when it comes to the organizational context, or one of the big goals, is how can we use the organization and its resources and the general context within the organization to help support what we call training transfer, which is sometimes referred to as transfer of training. Now, what is training transfer? Well, it's the extent to which training leads to changes in job performance. And there's a number of different drivers or things that we can use to build training transfer. One of the first ones that comes to mind is organizational support. And so by organizational support, I mean making sure that people have, that the managers in the organization are supportive of training, not just a person's immediate supervisor, but also upper levels of management as well, hopefully all the way up to the executive team. We want to make sure there's clear messaging and there's clear support available, and that employees and trainees perceive that there's support available from their manager. Because what this means is, think about a situation where you go through this training and then you get out of the training and your manager is telling you, forget everything you learned in that training program. It's not really valuable. Well, that's not going to help you transfer what you learned from the training to your actual job, which is really the goal of training. We can also think about organizational support in terms of peer support. So how much are people supporting each other within the training program? So trainee to trainee support, as well as when they get back to the job environment. Can people remind each other to apply what they learned in training on the job? Well, if so, that's likely going to enhance training transfer. Also, make sure to have technological support in place. And this is really important too when you're thinking about what kind of tools are being used in the training program itself. And that's something I'll talk about a little bit later on, but making sure there's high fidelity there, but making sure that people have what they need to be successful in taking what they learned in the training program and putting it back on the job. And then finally, give people opportunities to apply what they've learned in training. If someone goes through a training program and then they get back to the job and it's so busy and they don't have really that time and space to try to learn how to apply what they've done on training back on the job, and so then they revert back to the old ways of doing things, that's not going to help them transfer training, and that's going to inhibit their ability to transfer training back onto the job. So make sure that you provide people a space and recognize that it is going to take people a little bit of time typically to automatize and create a routine out of applying these new knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics or competencies and behaviors that they learned in the training program and apply those to the job. So when we talk about another area that we can focus on in the organizational context when it comes to training transfer, and that is training work environment similarity. And so what does this mean? Well, this is what I was mentioning before about the fidelity of the training. So that could be technological fidelity. So if you're learning if your job is an entirely, let's say, Windows-based, Windows computer or Windows operating system based company where everybody's using that, and then you do some offsite training that's only using the Mac operating system or Macintosh or Apple computers, well, that's probably going to lead to some degree of or lower levels of fidelity, because there's going to probably be some differences in terms of how things look, how things operate, and so forth. And so that would mean that the training to work environment similarity is going to be lower than it could be. So what would you do instead? Well, just make sure that if someone's doing offsite training, that trainer is providing people with the same type of technological platform that they're familiar with already and that they'll be using on the job. So that goes along with using the same or very similar equipment in training as you'd use on the job. And also make sure any kind of scenarios you give within the training context when you're teaching people or however the training's being delivered is to make sure that there's similarity in terms of the scenarios that are being described in training to what people actually experience on the job. This can also make the training seem more relevant to people and enhance their motivation to continue learning within the training environment as well. Now, finally, we'll consider too how training through principles can also be used to enhance training transfer. So what is training through principles? Well, briefly, it's really about just, as the name implies, communicating the principles behind why people are being trained to do something a certain way or how to do something. Okay? And so what this means is, in practical terms, be sure to give an explanation to trainees for why they're learning something. Explain the principles behind it. And a simple way of thinking about this is not just saying do this in training or learn how to do this, but to instead say learn how to do this because, or learn how to do this and here's why you should learn how to do this. Okay? This will give people a much deeper and richer understanding of what they're being trained on. Okay, so just to wrap up, the three drivers of training transfer that we're focusing on here are organizational support, training to work environment similarity, as well as training through principles. Now, one thing that I would like to say, though, when it comes to training transfer is practice, practice, practice. The old adage definitely applies here. If you want someone to learn something, you want them to learn it well, and you want them to learn it to the point that they're going to be ready to take it to their job, make sure they have opportunities to practice it within the training context and the training environment itself. And after they leave training, make sure that they have the opportunity to practice on the job. And this is where organizational support comes in too, and to make sure that what they've practiced looks similar to what they're going to experience back on the job. And also, if we're applying training through principles, make sure people understand why they're being asked to repeat and practice things over and over again. And you can even explain that this will help enhance their training transfer. Because after all, that's what we're really going for here with training, is teaching them things within the learning and training environment that they can go and apply to the job. Okay, so to wrap up, in this lecture, we first started with an overview of how we can go about enhancing learning and specifically looking at trainee characteristics in the organizational context, as well as how they interact generally with the training content or program itself. Then we did deeper dives into different types of trainee characteristics, such as personality, general cognitive ability, self-efficacy, motivation to learn, and metacognitive skill. And then finally, we finished up talking about the organizational context and specifically how we can use different features of the organizational context to help support and facilitate and drive the transfer of training from what people learned in the training program to their actual job and to ultimately improve their job performance, which should be a goal of the training program. So here are the references to the citations that you saw throughout this presentation here. And this wraps up the lecture on learning enhancement as a phase of the training process.